it's so horrible. And it just speaks to like the toxic messaging that women are given, that we're expected to, again, be thin and have a six pack and raise kids and work, and just the ridiculous toxic expectations that are placed on women.
Welcome to the Binge Dietitian podcast. I'm Jonathan, and I'm here to help you end 24/7 food thoughts, binge eating, and actually enjoy life with food. This episode is for educational and informational purposes only, not to be substituted for medical or personalized advice. Check the link in the description for my recovery resources, and let's get straight to the episode. Hey guys, welcome to the Binge Dietitian podcast, and I'd like to introduce a very special guest, Jennifer. But how about you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Sure. So I am an eating disorder therapist and founder of the Eating Disorder Center, which is a group practice based in Rockville, Maryland, but we work with clients in Maryland, Virginia, New York, Florida, and California. And then we provide recovery coaching worldwide as well. And I am also the co-author of a book, The Inside Scoop of Eating Disorder Recovery. And I've spoken on television and in the media about eating disorders as well.
That's amazing. And what's in your book? Like, what is the Inside Scoop about?
It's basically different chapters that are geared towards eating disorder recovery with kind of different helpful tips on different topics. Myself and the co-author kind of put things that we thought were crucial towards eating disorder recovery in the book. And so it's a short read, but it encompasses a lot of like important topics that we thought were helpful for eating disorder recovery.
And does it cover like each specific eating disorder, or is it just in general?
It does have certain chapters on specific eating disorders. So we do have a chapter on binge eating disorder, and I believe one on orthorexia. We also talk about anorexia, bulimia. So we do cover, I don't think we cover all the eating disorders, but a fair amount of them.
I mean, I'm sure that's going to be a super, super helpful resource. But so you seem very, very established with supporting people. I've been following you for, I can't remember, since I started an Instagram account when I was a student dietitian. You've been like promoting so many, what I like to call safe space content, because in Instagram there's a flood of disordered eating habits or influencers who are promoting disordered eating habits, which might be masked as healthy eating. But rewinding back many years, what made you, how did this all start? What made you want to start the Instagram? What made you want to start supporting people with eating disorders?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I struggled with my own eating disorder, which started out looking more like orthorexia and then transitioned more into anorexia. And then I went on to struggle with a variety of different eating disorder symptoms. And so going through my own process of struggling with the eating disorder and then recovering made me really passionate about speaking out against diet culture and anti-fat bias and some of these things that play into eating disorder development. And so I think I started the Instagram just as an outlet to kind of talk about these things that were making me angry in the media that I had kind of unlearned through my own recovery, but they were still all around me. And it was frustrating at that time. So I started writing and I started posting on social media. I then went back to school to become a therapist. I never thought that I would work with people with eating disorders, but in my clinical rotations in graduate school, I naturally gravitated towards the clients with eating disorders. And so then I sought more education and training. And now my whole practice is focused around eating disorders. But originally I thought I just wanted to be, a general therapist. But then I discovered that my true passion was helping people with eating disorders and body image issues.
Yeah. So as a therapist, is it easy? Do you need to have a certain certification to work with people with eating disorders?
There are a couple certifications, but no, ultimately you don't need to have a certification. It's more about having specialized training and experience. There's a lot of trainings out there. I also created my own trainings for professionals and people in recovery because I wasn't super happy with all the trainings that were out there. But you can't just call I guess you could, but it's not recommended to just call yourself an eating disorder therapist. That can definitely end in you doing more harm than good. It's important to actually do training. So I think the first one I did was I became a certified intuitive eating counselor. And then I did some additional trainings in eating disorders as well as trainings in dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, CBTE for eating disorders. So there's a lot of training out there, and it's really important to do training. And then if you can, ideally supervision with somebody who specializes in eating disorders so that you can talk about your cases and they can kind of help you when you're newer to the field or even just ongoing.
Yeah. I mean, like eating this, you see some, this is really bad, but I've seen some on Instagram, some nutritionists who say they're unqualified, they're not registered nutritionists. They got like a two-week course degree that is supporting people with eating disorders.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, did you ever come across like
pretty,
yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. And I think those people can like give coaches a bad name, for instance, because my practice does have some recovery coaches, but they're both, one is a registered dietitian and one is a licensed therapist in terms of their background. So I don't hire anyone who's done like a 2-week training. But unfortunately, there are people out there whose only qualification is that they maybe had an eating disorder. Maybe they still have an eating disorder, and they haven't done like any advanced training. And unfortunately, they can sometimes do more harm than good.
Yeah. I mean, going back to your story, Jennifer, with struggling with orthorexia, what turned into then anorexia. Did you search out for help with health professionals, and were they very accommodating of their eating disorder knowledge and just having a safe space, quote unquote, personality with you?
Yeah. So when I first started struggling with an eating disorder, I had been seeing a general therapist for multiple years, and he did not at all know how to help me. And he eventually was like, I went to a continuing education and it kind of sounded like you. It was someone with an eating disorder, but he was just like very confused. Like I remember I had a relationship at the time and I was planning a weekend away with my boyfriend, and I came in and I was crying hysterically, like there's no gym there this weekend and his mom's going to cook and I can't control the food. And he's like, is this about something deeper? Like, what are you really upset about? And I'm like, no, I'm really upset about the food. And like, I'm afraid I'm going to gain weight. And he was just so confused because he didn't treat eating disorders. So he was like, it must be something deeper. Like you're worried about taking this relationship to the next level. I'm like, no, I'm really not worried about that. It's the food and the fact that I was, obsessed with my gym routine and there was no gym there. So once I realized that I had a problem, I did seek out help from specialized eating disorder therapists, eating disorder dietitian, and a recovery coach. And that was like a breath of fresh air because they knew, what I was struggling with and they knew how to help me. And that's why I say it's so important to see a specialist. Even if you really like a therapist that you've been seeing their help on other issues, to like add a specialist to the team is really important because we don't get training in graduate school about eating disorders most of the time, like 99% of the time. And so a generalist therapist is usually not going to have the knowledge to treat somebody with an eating disorder unless they've sought out that like specialized training themselves.
Yeah. I mean, even me as a dietitian, once you here in the UK, once you graduate as a dietitian after 3 years or 4 years, you don't come out with eating disorder knowledge. Like some dietitians, they can be have this implicit bias where they say like, oh, let's say a patient with an eating disorder is now having one of the ideas, which is very weight biased, is saying like, okay, you're now at a healthy weight now. You can start cutting down on snacks and everything. I hear that every now and then, and it's like, oh, that's really bad.
Yeah, that's so bad. And unfortunately, even among like eating disorder professionals, there are people who hold weight bias and anti-fat bias. So it's important to find people who have done some of that work themselves and are not going to make those kind of comments.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a big topic, and it's a really great. So you provide training for like health professionals. Where can people find that?
Yeah, so it's on my website, which is www.theeatingdisordercenter.com. Under services, I have training, and I have one on body image, one on binge eating disorder and bulimia, and then a couple for people in recovery as well.
Okay, and I mean, whilst we're on the topic, where can people find to work with you and like you on Instagram or social media?
Yeah. So to work with me, they can go, or to work with my practice, they can go to www.theeatingdisordercenter.com and fill out the contact form. And then on Instagram, I'm Jennifer_Rollin, Rollin.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So I'll be putting that in the link in the description, but we'll also revisit that closer to the end of the podcast, just to remind people. So
Yeah.
so going back to the story, Jennifer, like the timeline. So you recognize back then you struggle with like disordered eating habits. You're feeling very anxious around food. There was no gym when you're having this time off with your boyfriend. Your therapist wasn't very understanding in terms of knowledge with your eating disorder. So once you recognize that, like your therapist didn't really recognize that, how did you recognize it was a problem, or what triggered you to get some help?
I think I had been a fairly normal eater before for a while. And so I recognized that something was wrong, that it wasn't normal. I mean, it was severely impacting my life at that point, where in the beginning of my eating disorder, like I was really anxious about the thought of going out to eat at restaurants. And so I didn't want to go out with my friends anymore. Um, I was very obsessed with weighing myself and very terrified of weight gain. Um, I was obsessively exercising. Like it really started to take over my whole life.
Mm.
And so it was hard for me to deny that this was a problem. Like again, another thing I would do is I remember my boyfriend at the time had a cookout at his house and I brought my own Tupperware with my like salmon and vegetables or whatever, instead of eating the burger and the hot dog like everybody else. So it was really limiting my life and I was really unhappy and, malnourished. So I was obviously starving and irritable and had those signs. So I knew that there was a problem. I think it took me getting to that point to realize it was a problem. Like in the beginning, I was like, oh, this is just a diet, because it did start out as a diet. I'm just being quote unquote healthy. But it became abundantly clear the more it spiraled, the more I was thinking about food in my body, like 80% of my day, that this is not normal, that I've changed, that I'm now obsessed with food and exercise and terrified of weight gain. So I recognized it was a problem. And like I said, then I went on and sought specialized help. And for me, that looked like meeting with a therapist, a dietitian, a recovery coach. And I remember like doing fear food challenges with my dietitian of like eating desserts together once a week that were very scary to me. And, talking through things in therapy, of course, which was super helpful. And then I also had coaching as well, which was just like that additional support because, therapy, again, is super helpful, but it was once a week and eating disorders are like 24/7. So I felt like I needed somebody that I could text in between. And as a therapist, I do let my clients reach out to me between sessions, but I don't think I felt comfortable reaching out to my therapist that I saw at the time. So it was nice to have somebody else that I could reach out to. Because again, eating disorders can be very isolating and I wasn't super open at the time with a lot of people in my life, who could support me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it can be very isolating. And what was your like relationship with your friends, family, loved ones? What was that like when you struggled with an eating disorder?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it was pretty bad. I was pretty irritable with my mom and angry when she would try to get me to eat more. I didn't want to see my friends because they always wanted to get together to be around food. And I was terrified of eating out at restaurants. And when I would go out, I would order like the fattest thing on the menu and then leave still being hungry. So, I was irritable and my relationship with my boyfriend was also not good. He really didn't have a lot of empathy or understanding for eating disorders. So he knew I had a problem, but he wasn't like super patient with me or anything like that. And it definitely, I think, caused some arguments and disagreements because he couldn't understand, why it was such a big deal for me to do certain things. So I would say like when I was first struggling with an eating disorder, it also made me very depressed because it makes sense when you're malnourished, you naturally start to feel depressed and irritable. And then I was also isolating myself from people and things that I had used to enjoy. And I was super fixated on food. I mean, at one point I thought maybe I'd become a personal trainer, which is laughable to me now, but like all I wanted to do was work out, think about working out and think about food, and like Google recipes that I would never eat and stuff like that. So it was a very sad, depressing existence for me. And I was like very unhappy, which is what prompted me to get help in the beginning.
Hmm. Wow. So, like hearing about your boyfriend then, about like having these. More of the reason why. Was it like more of the reason why you wanted to start your Instagram page to raise awareness, to let everyone, if everyone's boyfriends, everyone's girlfriends, loved ones, to know about the reality of having an eating disorder?
Yeah. I mean, I think it wasn't just from him. Like I had a friend at the time who, said that I was just being super shallow and superficial. And
Really?
yeah, like my personality had changed and that I was just like really shallow now. And was like, she was like talking about me behind my back. And I eventually found that out. Um,
Mm.
and yes, I think all of like the misunderstanding from people is what prompted me to want to speak out on social media and like help, like you said, to raise awareness and help people realize that, it wasn't like I had suddenly become shallow and full of myself, like this ex friend had said. It
Mm.
was that I was deeply struggling with a mental illness that was out of my control.
Mm.
Um, Again, similar to someone struggling with obsessive compulsive disorder, where they're having obsessions and compulsions around harming their child, it doesn't mean that they're going to harm their child. It means that they have a mental illness.
Mm.
Having an eating disorder doesn't mean that you're shallow and superficial. It means that you have a mental illness that's hijacked your brain.
Yeah. And so, like, with you struggling with your eating disorder, which is like a mental illness, which most people forget, like having an eating disorder literally changes your brain structure. If you're struggling with it actively, what did you do? What were you mentioned things about like exposure therapy with food. For people who are struggling with disordered eating habits, actually like anorexia, or like any kind of eating disorder subtype that would make you avoid certain food because of weight gain. What do you think? What would be really helpful if people are listening and they have an eating disorder right now?
Yeah. So I think it has to be both about addressing because I had a lot of rules and rituals
Mm.
around food and exercise. So I had to address those both with my therapist and with a dietitian. But I also had to address some of the underlying issues that were playing into the eating disorder. And that's kind of the work that I do with clients is you can't ignore one and just focus on the other. Like you really have to look at any underlying trauma, anxiety, relationship issues, and then also be looking at challenging food rules, exercise rules. For me, there was underlying anxiety and trauma, and other things that played and perfectionism, other issues that played into my development of an eating disorder. So I had to work on, like I said, both addressing the obsessions and compulsions around food, but then also looking at the underlying issues, which a therapist can really kind of help you to unpack both those things. And I think they're both so important.
Yeah. And for people who are listening, would you kindly explain like how does trauma lead to like eating disorders? How does like something that's not food related affect your diet?
Great question. So first disclaimer is that everyone's different, right? Everyone's trauma is different. Everyone's eating disorder is different. So it can show up in different ways. But if I'm talking in generalities, when we go through trauma and we're a survivor of trauma, things often feel out of control. We might blame our bodies for what happened to us. That's a common trauma reaction. And so, eating disorders, while they're not choices, and there are genetic components to them, they also can be coping skills at times for coping with feelings of experiences of past trauma where you felt powerless and saying, well, I felt powerless over again, this is usually subconscious of like, I felt powerless over what happened to me, but I feel like I can control food and I can control, you know, exercise and other things in my life. Um, so it can show up differently in different ways, but another way it can show up is, like I said, people blaming their body or feeling uncomfortable in their body. Um, if somebody has post-traumatic stress disorder, they might feel symptoms of hyper and hypoarousal in their bodies where they feel really dysregulated. And eating disorder behaviors help them to feel their nervous system to feel more regulated on a biological level. So they might not realize that that's why they're doing it, but it's like a calming or numbing sensation when they're feeling hypervigilant or depressed, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And if people recognize who are listening right now who might be thinking, oh, actually, yeah, maybe that trauma back then I struggled with is really fueling my eating disorder habits. What would you recommend if someone recognizes that their trauma is contributing to their eating habits?
It's really important, I think, to see a therapist who can work with both, either to see two therapists, one who does the trauma work and one who does the eating disorder, or one therapist who can do both, because we want to be helping the person to heal and process the trauma as well as the eating disorder. I will say that people have different philosophies, but usually they wait till somebody is more nourished in order to start trauma work, because it's not necessarily evidence-based to do trauma work with somebody when they have a super malnourished brain. So typically they work on making sure the person is nutritionally restored before starting on that deeper trauma processing work.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think that makes sense because I had this idea that like, okay, everyone helps at the same time, but it seems like there's a stepped approach where
Right.
it's effective.
Right. And it does make more sense, unless you're in a residential setting, to work on the eating disorder behaviors first so that the person can process the trauma without turning to eating disorder behaviors, if that makes sense. So typically, stabilizing the eating disorder, working on those behaviors, and then getting into the deeper trauma work is what's often advised. Again, unless you're in a higher level care where they feel that they can do that concurrently. But often those stays aren't super long-term anyway. So it still makes sense to wait until the person has more stability with food and their relationship to food in their body before starting that deeper trauma processing work.
Yeah. Well, Jennifer, so going on with your timeline. So what does your relationship with food look like now?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's pretty great. I should disclose that I am 36 weeks pregnant right now. So
Congratulations.
thank you. My husband and I are having our first kid. And I have a lot of compassion for anybody who's pregnant, struggling with an eating disorder, because I imagine that would be really hard. And it's really awesome that my relationship to food and my body has done a complete 180. Of course, it's important to disclaim that, I have some privilege being like a white cisgender, able-bodied, thin female. So it's important for me to name privilege in this conversation. But in terms of my relationship to food and my body, I haven't really experienced any negative body image over pregnancy, which has been really nice. And also I've had just like the best freedom with food, before pregnancy and in pregnancy. That hasn't changed. So lately, I've been having more. I've always loved dessert, but I've been wanting dessert more than usual. I think the baby just loves dessert. So my husband and I will go out and get ice cream multiple nights a week. I was eating a cupcake a day for a while. So, and the other thing is, I mentioned before, I used to be really phobic of eating out and really tied to the gym. And I've been able to listen to my body. And as soon as I got pregnant, I was just like, you know what? I don't know if you can tell in this conversation, but I do get a little more out of breath more quickly with the pregnancy. And so I haven't wanted to do any movement. I didn't do any movement for the first maybe 7 months. And then I was getting a little bit of back pain. So now I'll occasionally take a 10-minute walk with my husband, but definitely no gym happening here. Don't have a gym membership. And then in terms of food, I now love going out to eat, which is funny because I had such a bad phobia of going out to eat in my eating disorder at times. But going out to eat is now one of my favorite things to do. So I've been doing a lot of that with friends and family, which has been great. Just waiting, because I know once you have a newborn, it's a little bit harder to go out. So I'm trying to get in all my social events now.
God, as much as you can. Because
I'm trying to live it up. Yeah, before I have a crying newborn, and makes it a little more difficult to go out to eat. I'm
Oh,
hitting all the nice restaurants now.
yeah.
So yeah, it's truly been a 180, and it's nice that I've been able to just like enjoy this pregnancy and not be worried about weight gain or what I'm eating. And like I said, I really feel for people who are caught in an eating disorder in pregnancy, because I imagine that that would be really tough.
Yeah. And also, I can only imagine, um, like once you give birth, like afterwards, you have this body image, like this idea of like, make sure to lose your baby fat. I forgot
Yeah.
what belly, whatever it's called.
Like, yeah. The messaging around pregnancy and postpartum is really awful. Like I've seen articles online that I haven't clicked on them, but that are like how to not gain too much weight in pregnancy and, get your body back postpartum, and just like all this absolute bullshit out there in the media.
Yeah.
And it's sad because moms are so vulnerable after they give birth. Like your hormones change, like you have a new baby, you're not sleeping. And then diet culture and anti-fat bias is like, and your body should look like you never had a baby, and you should focus on that instead of like bonding to this new life that your body just miraculously brought into the world.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think I can't remember. I saw it. It was a while back, maybe a year ago. Like, there's this Instagram I found it in an article online that what is this fitness influencer gave birth 2 weeks ago, but still has six-pack abs.
Oh God.
And she says, "Well, if I could do it with two kids, then you can do it too. No excuses." And I was thinking, "Oh no, this is really bad."
Yeah, it's so horrible, and it just speaks to like the toxic messaging that women are given, that we're expected to, again, be thin and have a six pack and raise kids and work, and just the ridiculous toxic expectations that are placed on women. Again, it's like your body has just done this incredible, amazing thing of like growing a baby and growing literal organs.
Mhm.
And the media and society is focused on like fitting back into that swimsuit. Like the priorities are just so skewed in terms of what they say is important.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's not like you're gonna have a photo shoot anytime soon. I can only imagine after having a baby.
Well, actually, you'd be surprised. We have
Really?
there's a newborn photo shoot, which I will be in, maybe like 8 to
Oh, yeah,
15
those
months
kinds of photos.
after.
Yeah,
Yeah, not, yeah, no, nobody's having like a swimsuit shoot over
yeah,
here,
that's what
but
it is.
we will have a newborn shoot, which I'm excited about, where they get pictures of the baby and they get pictures of you with the baby.
Oh,
But I think regardless, it's just putting pressure on women who, like I said, are in a really vulnerable time in their life. And I do think that people of all genders struggle with eating disorders and body image issues. I think, and there is increasing pressure on men, but I think on a societal level, it seems like, for men, there is more social acceptability of like this idea of like a dad bod versus a mom
oh, yeah,
bod, which is funny because it's not like men are the one having the children. Um,
yeah.
but regardless, I do think that like diet culture is permeating and really impacting people of all genders. I just think that, women unfortunately are the ones who are more likely to reach out for help because of stigma.
Yeah, that's actually a really, really interesting point. Does your baby have a name? You don't have to
Yeah.
give the name if you don't want to.
I'm not sharing the name publicly yet, but I
Yeah, you
will
don't
be
have to.
announcing it on my Instagram. He does have a name. I will give you the hint that it is nature themed. We picked
Oh,
nature themed names for him and for future children. Um, But yeah, I think it'll be interesting, like getting to raise a son and hopefully raise a son who's emotionally mature and,
yeah.
not invested in diet culture. Um, I think that'll be a really fun and also challenging experience of like raising a kid in today's society. But, my husband and I are on the same page and have very similar values, and he's a very normal eater. So I'm excited about that with
Yeah.
raising kids.
Uh, Actually, on this topic, since I'm speaking to an eating disorder therapist, which is extremely amazing, what would you recommend if on the topic of like, so let's say someone is struggling with a relationship with food and they don't have a supportive partner, husband, boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever. How can you navigate recovery, like healing from your relationship with food if someone you live with is not supportive?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great question. I would definitely recommend setting boundaries with that person and saying, like, for instance, if your partner is on a diet, saying that's not helpful for me in my recovery. So, it's your body. You could do whatever you want, but I would ask that you not talk about it around me. So I think setting healthy boundaries with the partner. Also, sometimes I will bring partners into therapy sessions. So if you have a therapist, asking if partner can come into this session to talk about ways in which they can support you, ways in which they might be getting in the way. Um, and then ultimately you have to ask yourself, like, is this a deal breaker for me? Like, is this something where I'm okay to stay with somebody who maybe has a different perspective than I do, one that's not helpful to my recovery? Are they willing to get some education around what would help me in my recovery? Or does this ultimately feel like this relationship is not going to work out and it's a deal breaker?
By the way, just a quick break from the podcast to let you know of my free hunger regulation webinar series, which is in the link in the description of this podcast. There's also an ebook version if you're more of a reader than a watcher. This is the perfect resource I wish I had when I struggled with binge eating years ago, which is used to guide you from everything you need to know, from why we binge, what are the binge triggers, and the eating pattern to stop binge eating. Because when we've been struggling with binge eating for so long, you and your body lose touch of what normal hunger and normal fullness is. You're constantly on feast or famine mode. So head to the link in the description of this podcast for the free hunger regulation resources to have a clear game plan to tackle binge eating for good. Anyway, let's get straight back to the episode. I mean, that is a very serious thing. Like, just how the partner is towards a relationship with food. I actually had a friend. Well, I'm actually sharing like personal things. Well, I have a friend actually. She's with someone who's seems all right for her, but like we had an argument, and then the guy said like, "Oh, you're just so fat, and I don't love you, and maybe if you eat better, then I'll love you better." And he used her body image against him against her in an argument, and I was thinking that should be a deal breaker.
Yeah, that would be 100% a deal breaker for me. And I agree. Like, I think if somebody is going to weaponize your body size against you or your body image issues, I would hope that that would be a deal breaker, or that you could go to therapy with them, like couples counseling, and kind of work things out. For me, when I was dating, that was like a deal breaker for me, is I didn't want to be with anybody who was on a diet or who was obsessed with going to the gym, because I lived that life and it wasn't fun for me. So it was important to me that whoever I dated had a good relationship with food, which is more limiting than you would think in terms of the dating pool out there. But it just so happened that when I met my husband, like, he had a very normal relationship with food. He doesn't go to the gym. That just wasn't. And again, I'm not saying that it's necessarily a problem to go to the gym. There are people who go and they're not obsessive about it. But yeah, my husband is just somebody who's kind of an intuitive eater, always kind of has been. And so that's nice, that we were kind of on the same page about that, especially when it comes to like raising kids, thinking about what like values you want to impart to them. He's pretty much like on the same page as me. So I think that's been useful. But I would say if you're not on the same page, especially if you want a more serious relationship and you eventually want kids, I think couples counseling can be really helpful with a therapist who's like anti-diet, somebody who's really on that side who can help you out.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. Well, I'm just gonna be wrapping up for the podcast, if that's okay, Jennifer. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's one more thing I'd like to ask. So you mentioned a while back, whilst I got a chance to speak with an amazing therapist. So DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. So for people who are currently struggling with binge eating, in this podcast, what are some DBT skills that can help people reduce their urges to binge eat?
That's a great question. DBT has a ton of skills that can be useful for people. There's one that talks about different mind states. So wise mind, reasonable mind, and emotion mind, and helping people to make wise-minded decisions, which are usually values aligned, versus when we're feeling triggered to want to binge, often we're in emotion mind. We're caught up in our feelings, right? So helping people to come from more of a wide-minded perspective can be useful. There's another skill I like to use called a behavior chain analysis from DBT. And that's where we think about all our behaviors as really like links in a chain. And at the end of the chain is the binge. And so you start with what happened at the beginning of the day? What time did you wake up? How are you feeling? What did you have for breakfast? And you work your way, because once you figure out which links in the chain led to the binge, you can work on challenging those chain links, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
really exploring the vulnerability factors and what was behind the person starting to binge. I also have a skill that I made up myself called the pause skill, which I can send you the link to put in the show notes
Yeah.
from a blog post I wrote, but it's similar to DBT. It's an acronym, and each letter stands for something different that you're supposed to do, which can also be helpful for binge eating, because I find that many of my clients who binge, it can become very automatic to where there's no space between when they feel the urge to binge and when they act on it. And so part of the skills that we're using is helping them learn how to use other skills and put some space between urge and action. So eventually they can make other choices, so they feel more conscious and more able to make informed choices instead of on this like autopilot, just kind of acting on urges, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Is it very similar to urge surfing?
Hmm.
The pause,
Yeah.
pause skills?
Yeah, it's definitely similar to urge surfing, which we use both for eating disorders as well as for substance use treatment. And part of urge surfing is where research shows that most urges do come down eventually if we're able to sit with them, sometimes in as little as 30 minutes, but sometimes longer. And so if you think of the urge as raising and peaking and then you act on it, it's like kind of like a bell curve. And so what we want to do is have people learn how to have that urge raise and peak, and then they're able to use other skills, and naturally it will come down on its own instead of getting caught in that loop of, I feel the urge, I act on it. And so now I'm in this small circle of feeling the urge and acting on it, instead of realizing I can use other skills and tools, and eventually it will come down naturally on its own without me acting on it.
Yeah, that's really helpful, because when I struggle with binge eating, once I have even just a tiny bit of an urge, I just think, oh well, that's it. Might as well just do it
Yep.
now. There's no stopping now. And
Yeah.
surfing back then would have been really helpful for me.
Yeah. And binging was one of the behaviors that I struggled with as well. And I definitely related to that feeling of almost like an out of body experience of like, I felt
Yeah.
almost like possessed of like, I have no control in this moment. Like I am just acting on these urges with no space in between them.
Yeah, and you don't even enjoy the food. You just like an
Right.
autopilot. You just like putting it in your mouth mechanically. It just like you're rushing it in. It's not even enjoyable sometimes.
Right. It's usually what I tell people, because this is true. It's usually like maybe 30 seconds of it feels enjoyable. And then you start to feel terrible, both physically and emotionally. Like you feel, why am I doing this again? People often struggle with beating themselves up. You feel like physically really uncomfortable. But it's just one of those behaviors that can be really difficult to stop, especially on your own. And that's why it's so helpful to have like professional support from experts who can help you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, since you're a wealth of knowledge, Jennifer, I'd just like to reiterate that if people want to work with Jennifer, then I'll put the link in the description of the podcast to where to find, follow, and work with Jennifer. And
Awesome.
yeah, and there's one final question, which I give it as an ending note for all of the guests. So the previous guest would give a question for the current guest, which is you. Yeah. So the previous guest, Michael Ujoa, who is a personal trainer, he liked to ask you, Jennifer, if there's one meal you can have every single day for the rest of your life, what would it be?
So I've been on a pasta kick lately, so it'd probably be some kind of pasta, either really well done macaroni and cheese, or I had some really good gnocchi. I don't know if I'm saying that right lately. Recently with pomodoro sauce that was also delicious.
That's really
So
good.
really any kind of pasta would be something I could easily eat on a daily basis.
Oh, I wouldn't think macaroni and cheese would count as pasta, but I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that's a very American thing, American answer. Because I know in other parts of the world, they're like, what? You put cheese on your pasta? The other kind of pasta, side note, that is not American, I went to Italy with my husband over a year ago, and they have something called cacio e pepe.
What's that?
It's pasta with cheese and pepper. It literally means cheese and pepper, cacio e pepe.
Oh,
And it is so delicious. They like make it in this creamy cheese sauce with pepper and like homemade pasta. And now I want to go back to Italy or have my husband make it because it is really excellent.
you're making me hungry now.
Yeah.
Wow, pasta. Okay, well, Jennifer, like if there's one, so what's the next question you'd like to give for the next guest?
I guess my question would be, I'm going to go with a deep question because I like to ask deep questions.
Difficult therapist.
Yeah. So let's say you're in your 90s looking back on your life, what will you wish you would have spent less time doing? That's my question.
If you were in the 90s?
If you were in your 90s, like you're 90 years old and you're looking back
90.
on your life,
Yeah.
what would you say that you wish you would have spent less time doing?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Yeah, mine.
Wow. Well, that'll be really interesting. I'm looking forward to that. Well, Jennifer, thanks for coming along to the podcast, and I hope you have a really, really lovely day.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Struggling with binge eating? Gain access to my exclusive, self-paced binge eating freedom course, found in the link in the description of this podcast. My course is everything I wish I knew when I struggled with binge eating, but it's all wrapped up into one easy-to-understand platform. You'll finally learn how to put an end to binge eating and put an end to food dictating everything you do, controlling your life. Access it now in the link in the description of this podcast.